Kwe Valdasi Bejidayo Nigeola Imudiaka Olnuegadi Migamagi Unama'ki Teluidasi Kedu Wigumuno Deladega Ula Mawiomi Weskawasik Gitto Ewistudi Desnena Olnodiek Weldasi Bejidachigla Nimajuino Lewistudi Desnen. So I just want to welcome everybody to this talking circle. We are on in my territory. We never sold it. We never surrendered it, and they never wiped us out. So we're still here. And I just want to say that this talking circle has kind of foundations to it. Normally, we would have a smudging ceremony, and I'm not sure if they would allow smudging in this place, so I didn't bring a smudge bowl. So that's why I said we're going to have a dry, dead fire smudge. Is that what you called it, Jill? Anyway, so I want to give thanks to the 7 sacred entities that we believe in. Kisuokolal yeguchitande taiganamuyek usit kamoi mudiek mi wadamek tande taiganamuyek. Niskamis nagu sedewin welal yeguchitande tai iganamuyek and tija amijmina. Anquayuxieg alokoluxieg negawa iganamuxieg mogignewadi. And kijin and maamige welali eguchit tande ta iganamuye welali eguchit sisip ka oasis tande ta nigwek mi wadamek tande ta yedegul sit kamuik to elidas wadamek uchi sioni majostinen uchibano kelu kanade layman welali eguchit tande iganamuye nigela kelu nago wechkwagim chikeluzi chija amishka Eridaswa una kiliganamuinen malgignawadi an madigam ka iganamuyak ni majua andana muchpananuda ninen majukwadamanen. Kes nuna de lay modio, kodes nuk, he modio, kisiguisquat nugmia, welali eguchi tandelian koyuyaga, tandelginami, tan delgisi modiak, lausit kamwiktuk. Miwa de mek tandesakta yedekla, Elidaswa de mek. Nadel not oltio emodio kesno welali ucitandeli ankamieg ninen waliak kamieg ninen dan emodiega mogigne wodieda monek o adno nade an kitchen emodio welali ucitandeli kisuliega bolok sit kamuikto. What I said was, giver of life, thank you for giving us this world that we live in and enjoy and thank you for sending us the good spirits. I look at Grandfather Sun and thank Grandfather Sun for providing us with our shadows, and our shadows are representations of our ancestors that have gone into the spirit world. They are following us all the time. We are connected to them by our feet, and they are looking after us and protecting us and giving us strength. I looked to Mother Earth and thanked her for providing us, our mother, for providing us with the birds, plants, animals, and fish. And combined with the earth itself, water, fire, and air, we are grateful that Mother Earth provides us with all the necessities of life. I look to the direction of the rising sun, our culture hero, Glooskap. He's a representation of leadership, and he gives us an example of how we should live so that we would be strong and healthy, and in terms of following him, we would be given a good life. We look to the south to the grandmothers who have taught us everything we need to know in order to survive on Mother Earth. So we are grateful for the wisdom and knowledge that she imparts upon us, and we are grateful that she sends good spirits to us in this talking circle. And I look to the west and thank the young people. The young people are looking at us, and we as adults have to live accordingly. We leave a legacy of survival for those young people. So we are grateful that they are sending good spirits to us in our gathering today, in our talking circle. And then we look to the north to thank our mothers who brought us into this world and helped the giver of life and created life. And our mothers cleaned us, washed us, fed us, and took care of us and taught us how to take care of each other as brothers and sisters, and how to rely on each other and how to love one another. So we are grateful that our mothers have put us here in this world. So this is how our talking circle begins. And the context for the talking circle, before contact, our people used to gather together in our wigwams, in our lodges, around a fire. And all day our people will be walking, being in canoes or on toboggans or sleds or snowshoes, whatever else. We're walking on snow, walking on ice, traveling on water and on the earth itself. So we would travel all around, and we were either gathering or hunting or fishing or um, gathering birds and eggs and whatever else. So in essence, we don't speak to one another all day. And at the end of the day, we come back, and our grandfather or great grandfather is sitting there by the fire, and he'll say, "Oh, my children, what have you brought? What did you see today?" And so everybody will say, "Well, I was over here. I went over that hill, and there's no more moose in that area." And somebody would say, "Well, I was up this river and down the other end as well, and I didn't see too much fish." And maybe a mother will say, "Well, we were gathering berries over here or over there, and there doesn't seem to be too much going on." And then another person would chime in and say, "Well, it's not much. Our food is diminishing, and our clothes are beginning to wear out." So the grandfather would say, "Okay, well, it's time for us to move. Let's pull up tomorrow, and we'll move maybe the distance of the length of the river maybe at the end, and we'll survive over there." So the family has gone out and scattered around, and now they're doing an environmental impact assessment and giving their report to the great grandfather. And so this is the nature of the talking circles, because everybody's sitting around the fire inside the wigwam, and everybody's talking one at a time. They might take an eagle feather, they might take a talking stick, or they might just talk one by one and respectfully wait for the other one to finish speaking and then speak only one at a time. So the context of the talking circle is we talk one at a time and in a certain pattern. And I was reading some of the articles and examples of some of the writings that Danielle has provided me, that some of you have written. And the idea about reconciliation or conciliation, the idea about racism that's happening in North America and elsewhere around the world, it is a really hot item, and land acknowledgements as well. So there are a lot of concerns among the artist world, I guess I would call it that, and some of the means to be able to send messages to society is through arts and performance and expressions coming from inside of us, the soul and the spirit and the heart. That's what's coming out as expression. And honesty and truth and respect and dignity are some of the key elements that Indigenous people speak about. And so I think this is an opportunity for us to continue in this process to highlight some of the concerns and issues that we all have in the area of Indigenous performing arts or creative arts and expressions. And so I will start the talking circle by inviting Daniel to chime in and talk about his project here. So Daniel.
So thank you, Chief Stephen. So I'm Daniel MacIvor. I'm here in Unama'ki, which is colonially known as Cape Breton Island, sitting a couple of rooms away from Chief Stephen. And I'm a fifth and sixth generation Scottish settler, MacLean and MacIvor. And both families came from the Outer Hebrides, which is off the western coast of Scotland. And I've made my life as a practitioner of theater. And very recently, I went back to school at 58 to get my master's at the University of Toronto and in performance studies, drama and theater. And one of the courses, I had an opportunity to take in any number of electives, and one of the courses that I ended up taking was a course called Palatial Dramaturgy and Indigenous Performance, which was taught by Jill Carter, who's with us today. And also I had the opportunity because of that course to read some of the scholarship written by Floyd Favel, who is also with us today, very gratefully. I had, as a settler, become concerned about what I could do, how my practice, what I could do in my practice to acknowledge my place on this land, in this place, that I didn't, I never really, I had always been aware of the fact that growing up here in Sydney, in Membertou, which is the reserve or the First Nation here, the Mi'kmaq Nation at Membertou, is in the city. And so it was always very much, I was aware of the community, of the Mi'kmaq community, going to school, and I was always very conscious of a certain, the idea of place and what that meant for that community, and it was different than for me. In fact, my own experience has been as a Scottish settler not to be very connected to ancestors at all. I really don't know that much about my people. So all of that is to say, when I ended up in this course, it was the first time that I had understood that I had felt some hope about the idea that there was a way to work to unsettle. To unsettle was, for me, was possible in my practice. What I found really interesting was that I realized when reading some of the scholarship and listening to Jill talk and reading her work, understanding that in some ways, I'm just going to, something that Floyd wrote, an article, which was called The Artificial Tree, talks about Native performance culture as developing the practices of our ancestors. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but coming about not as a clearly formulated plan based on a clear vision, but as a feeling, an intuition born of personal, cultural, and universal needs. And that struck me very deeply because I had always, that felt like that's a bit how my work came to be. It wasn't an intellectual work, my practice, making theater. And I started to wonder if in fact I wasn't actually being exposed to Indigenous knowledge from the land without knowing. So I was very excited by the thought that there was a way to, I guess the word that I've been using is bridging, and I'm not exactly sure if that's if that's the right word, but it feels right. It feels like something. I'm hoping maybe if there's a better word, I'm happy to hear. So I'm also very interested in not just, and all of this for me, this idea of looking at other ways of telling stories, other ways, what narrative can look like. not just in terms of dealing with stories that are somehow based in relationships with Indigenous communities. I'm interested in looking at different ways to new narratives for all stories, for any story. I've never felt entirely comfortable with that sort of typical achievement, you know, the hero on the journey, and they get the thing or they don't get the thing, and then they win or they lose. I've always felt that was the least interesting thing. And in a conversation recently with Zach, you know, we were talking about the web, the circle, and the web inside the circle, and that what was exciting about that was the idea that the stories are all relational, and that made a lot of sense to me. So I really come to listen, even though I seem to be talking a lot. But that's I'm verbal. So these are my feelings and thoughts just to begin, and I will stop now.
Ooh, nice words. Yeah, thank you.
I will go down the list here and ask Floyd, I guess, to speak next.
Oh, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. My Cree name is Kiskau Kutse, and my ancestors, they came here from the east. They were Assiniboine Métis, and they ended up being taken by Chief Poundmaker, to live in this community. So that is, and then my mother's side, they came from the north. They were Ojibwe Soto people, and so they came from the Great Lakes area and came this way to live in the north here. And so that's my mother's. That was my mother's, her people's journey, and then so like in the exploration to narratives and dramaturgical structures, like I deliberately undertook that many years ago because it was my interest, and because I heard a lot of stories when I was young. My mother told a lot of stories, my father as well. They didn't sit down with us and say, well, I'm going to tell you a story. It was just a part of the fabric of life. And as a young couple, I'm always amazed that by the time they were 30, they had born and raised 6 children. They had imparted a whole world view and language to another generation. They were a young couple, and they had imparted that. And that's what now we carry forward into the future. And hopefully we can impart what we were taught by our parents as well. And so when I was 19, I ended up going to school in Europe in Denmark and in Italy. And in Denmark, I studied with the Inuit and Sami people. And the goal at that time was to bridge indigenous performance with Western performance. That was the goal. And then thereafter, I went to school in Italy with he was a very well-known Polish theater director. His name was Jerzy Grotowski. And so I ended up working with him for 2.5 years. I was one of the students. I was not in any way like an important collaborator. I was just another person. I was an ethnic minority in the space, and I was an indigenous person in the space, running around and training. So I was not at all any important collaborator, and I didn't ask questions. I was just finding myself as slowly formulating how to think and ask questions regarding theater when I was there. And so over the years, my main goal was when I came, and one of the big inspirations was a Japanese theater director. His name is Tadashi Suzuki. In Japan, I did visit him, and I did ask him a few questions about narrative structures. I asked him the ceremonial use of voice we have in some of our ceremonies, how people pray, like and then I asked him the ceremonial use of voice that we have in ceremonies, also like even ceremonies like and I'm open to talk about this because I did ask my uncle, he's a medicine man. What about things like shaking tent? I said, how those spirits talk. I said, oh, no, like it's like a puppet show in the dark. I said, is it all right, uncle, if I use those ways of talking in a show sometime at some point? And he had said, yes, because you are not pretending to make a ceremony. You're just using the voice. So that's okay. And my uncle, he doesn't talk English. So we were talking in Cree. So manan tochi kapatita nexisam ka pikswe chik manamke. That's what I asked him. And he said, monanto. Nanto is moye metawaki makatepi aptita tansami speaks with it. So you're just using the voice. And I asked Suzuki, what do you think if I use ceremonial use of voice as a starting point for dialogue or monologue or soliloquy? And what do you think? Because if you look at Suzuki's dramas, he used Greek classics because of the long monologues. And he was able to apply a Japanese use of voice, Japanese vocal structure, translating them to these classical texts. The reason why was I asked him, well, why Greek texts? Why not your own? And he said, well, there exists already the No theater and the Kabuki theater and Banraku, etc. So, well, there's already that, he said, but this Western drama, we don't have that, he said. So our work is plant this Western drama into this Japanese vocal physical structures. That's why we're using Western dramas, he said. And so that kind of, so I thought about it over the years, and over the years I came to the conclusion as well that, well, as Indigenous people, well, Cree people, I can't speak for all Indigenous people, Cree people, we didn't have that as well. We didn't have an elaborated theatrical structure, a theatrical performance. But there is performative elements in our ceremonies, which resemble theater. There is a narrative, there is action, there is image, and it takes place in a specialized space. So there's always those four elements, which you also find in ritual and ceremony. The fifth element is always healing element, a healing communal element. That's the fifth one. And that was my explorations as I was thinking of my own Indigenous theater work of, okay, now how to bridge those two separate worlds. And in many ways, it's not a bridge because we're on Turtle Island. So we're not bridging any place because we're already here. So what we are doing, what I thought is what we are doing is we are taking this Western drama and planting it here, putting it into this land, the rhythms and structures of this land. So to that end, I have written dramas. I was telling Paula earlier, I'm not a playwright. I was forced by Canadian theater systems to become a playwright because that was the established standard at that time. Everybody was a playwright or an actor. So, but there was no room for theoreticians. Like, can you imagine if I went Daniel MacIvor and you, when you were in Toronto in 1990s, hi, I'm a theoretician, right? You would have laughed, right? So it was not a very popular field to create, to be a theorist. But now I've come to the conclusion, it's like, actually, the Canadian theater system created some falsehoods for me. I was thinking, so now I say I'm a theoretician, a theorist, a cultural practitioner, because I practice my Cree cultural ceremonies. I'm open about this too. It's like, because like now, next year I make my 4th Sundance. I make them. I'm sponsoring of them. Remember, and so other ceremonies. So that's my second thing, is ceremonialist. And but theorist first. It's 3rd and 4th theater person. Those are my 3rd and 4th profession. And one is a historian too, through this museum. Through this theater, this theory, first one, the theory is, that's why I'm here right now. It's like, so now, so I haven't yet been able to, I've incorporated some of these theories into plays that I wrote, created, developed over the years. And, but next year at the Performance Festival, I'm hoping to do the Trojan Women by Euripides. And there apply ceremonial ways of speaking to the dialogue, to the monologues, to the chorus, and the use of Plains Indian Sign Language, which is what we have been exploring here at our festival by having Plains Indian Sign Language workshops. And so the reason is it's the best way to learn an Indigenous language. It's by far the best. And so, but also within that is the seeds for method, storytelling method. And if you look at how we tell stories, they're always sitting or on our knees, because we live in small spaces. We were in tents. So always on our knees or sitting, and upper body moving. And the narrative structures is generally they're action narratives. And they, in many ways, how I introduce myself, you always have an introduction. You must always tell who you are. Those comes from the creation story. In the creation story, the first human being, he said, first of all, he said, I give thanks to the great spirit for making me. And then all the creation beings that had been created before him, they went, ah, aho. So they say that's why nowadays when people are talking, the audience must always go, huh, mm-hmm. They're acknowledging the speaker. So already there is a narrative structure that, and even the audience must take part. And you always introduce that. So for example, if you read the text of Black Elk, the prophet, you see all his old warrior friends, they introduce themselves the same way. They'll always say, my name is Standing Elk. I was born in the moon when the ponies shed their hair. They will always tell the moon that they were born in. That's a narrative structure. And sometimes I look at these old narratives and I think, why don't we see these in Indigenous drama? Those are Indigenous narrative structures. That's the beginnings. And then also within the Indigenous, for example, Cree language, our stories, because that's why they're part of why sign language works, is their action narrative. There's a lot of action words. They're progressing those stories all the time. And they're linked with each other. All those stories are linked. Those sacred, I won't say his name, our elder brother, because now the snow has melted. And also it's April. You can't tell sacred stories in April. So I won't say his name. So that in those sacred stories of our elder brother, all those stories are linked. Of the time he killed a duck, He fooled some ducks, he killed them, tried to cook them. A fox stole them, he got mad, he sat on some rocks, and so on and so forth. They're all linked. And then even linked to the time of the flood and why we live in this fourth world. So there are a series of linked narratives that are full of action and narrative. And everything has a sacred story. So, but anyways, I'll stop there. Thank you for giving me the time. Hi, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Floyd. We'll be probably have about 15 minutes per person. So that would give us some time to reflect again on what some others have said. So Paula, you're next.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, Chief Stephen, very much. Thank you, Daniel, for inviting me to join you all here. I'm speaking to you from Montreal, from Coyote, and I'm here. I'm a theater dramaturge primarily. I'm a theater practitioner. My mother's people come from Nova Scotia. Her father was from Glace Bay, and but their people were from Scotland mostly. I think, Daniel, your heritage and mine are similar in that regard from my mother's line. My father was Australian, and I don't really know very much about my father's people. We didn't learn very much about them. My last name is Dankert, and the only Dankerts I know are people who are directly related to me. So there's a lot of mystery around how my father grew up in Australia, partly in Melbourne, partly in the outback. But I was raised mostly in and around Toronto, a little bit in Chicago, and I live sometimes now in Montreal. And I came, like Daniel, I came very late to academia. I undertook a PhD, 5.5 years ago now, I guess, almost 6 years. And so I'm recent to academia, but I have spent 30 years working in theater and in opera, in film, in dance, and television, in the performing arts. And I'm very interested to be here today in this talking about listening. I like to think of myself as a pretty good listener, and I say that because I like listening, and I've always liked listening. And in fact, my professional career in the early years started in radio, and it began there largely because I like listening. And to me, listening and hearing stories, the oral world is a very visual world. And I've always associated sound and hearing with, it's that these things go together for me. And that meeting place in my mind is how I think of the imagination and how it can create worlds for us in which to share and communicate. So radio was a big part of that listening aspect of my life. And sound, I'm a Foley artist too, so sound was a part of that as well. But I always loved the theater and making plays. And Floyd, as you say, Floyd and I worked together back in the day and worked in workshop scenarios where either you were being made a playwright or an actor. So it's interesting, Floyd, to hear you speak of that. The way we were working then and the kind of models that were really being cemented and sealed in those years. And in some ways, I think maybe, Daniel, those are things that you were working against in making your own work, I would venture to say. But while that was happening, I was working as a dramaturge. I was reading a lot of plays and a lot of those scripts and doing a lot of workshops. And that's sort of what brought me into dramaturgy. And that's how I've kind of really spent most of my life, is working as a dramaturg. And so this idea of bridging gaps is very interesting to me too. And I liked what you said, Floyd, in a way about the fact that perhaps, well, I don't know if it's a fact, but that we're not bridging because, well, I think that's really interesting how we've gone from this idea of a kind of colonialist version of what a model of making theater looks like, and a place where now we're bridging gaps, but the colonializer is the person who started to set those models in place. And this is what makes me feel like listening is becoming more and more important again, because of how backwards that system is. And I think I appreciated that point you were making, Floyd. And that is something that I've come to learn in my time working as a dramaturg, is I thought listening was really important because it was about making stories and having them heard and seen in different ways and in new ways. What I came to learn was that the listening for me was also really seriously about education and learning, not new ways, but even old ways. And in the decades of working as a dramaturg, I've worked on many, many projects with Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists and collaborators. And those years are the years that listening and the education that I have had to take on in order to honor my work as a dramaturg, to honor the land where I live and the people I work with, has been the biggest job of the work that I've done over the years. Because this idea, Chief Stephen, that you mentioned about the idea of art, expression coming out from inside of us, I think is one of the most important things that we can do in the performing arts. And what I used to think in the early days had more to do with, Floyd, the reference you were making about these models that turned somebody into a playwright or an actor. What I've come to learn all these years later is that this dramaturgy is more about liberating what's inside to come out, that it's about the artist, the dramaturgy. What I've learned in that listening and that education is that the dramaturgy exists deep inside the artist. And the work of bringing that out into whatever form is the most important dramaturgical work. So those are things that have been a part of my education. I have something I could read. It's just a couple of minutes before, and then I guess I might be done here. But since I started this work in academia, I'm doing a PhD and I'm writing a dissertation, and I'm writing a lot about collaborations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, people. Recently, I worked on an opera called Missing, which was, the librettist is Marie Clements, and she is Dene, Métis, and she lives on Galiano Island most of the time. It was a big project that was, all the singers were Indigenous singers. The conductor of the opera was Creek Choctaw from Oklahoma. The singers were from various places, mostly Turtle Island. The composer was a white settler Canadian. I was the dramaturge. The director was a white settler. So we were a mix, and it was complex and wonderful, really difficult. And so I'm just going to read something that I have that expresses something of where I'm at now in the work that I'm doing. Making a new performance work with a mix of people from varied cultural backgrounds who carry with them conflicting experiences of similar events is a complicated endeavor in creating connections and identifying gaps. It is a process of finding links between what is known and unknown, or severing what is assumed from what can be understood. With a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists working together, these collaborations, in my experience, are always about exposing and exploring a worldview that is either a complete departure from the reigning or master narrative, or a reordering of accounts. The point is to tell stories that have been buried, outlawed, or negated in the name of hegemonic rule. Making the unsung heard is as valuable to historiographical accuracy as telling untold stories is to addressing injustice. As institutions slowly wake up to the necessity of setting the story straight, incremental changes are being made to funding and programming, which influence public discourse. Awareness in the putative age of reconciliation is bringing about redistribution of opportunity. But how much is really shifting? Where can the changes be seen and felt? Are artistic collaborations impacting presumptuous power structures within organizations or elsewhere? Are we getting at the central issues of a relationship that was forged in trauma? How far are we willing to go to change the relationship? Can we rearrange dramaturgical processes to accurately reflect what is happening in our current relationships as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples? So these are some of the questions that I'm asking myself that guides the work that I'm doing now. And Jill Carter is my supervisor. I'm extremely fortunate, and she's so wonderful to see her, have her here. That's where my thoughts are at this point in time regarding this subject matter. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I just next coming up, I'd like to hear Zach. I think he mentioned. I will come to Jill next to kind of reflect on her work and her perspectives. Go ahead, Zach.
Gwegwe Oki, hello everyone. My name is Zach running Coyote. I am zooming to you from Mohkinstsis, which is the territory of the Blackfoot people, the Stoney Nakoda people, as well as this is the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And I'm about 200 meters, maybe 300 meters from the Makma, the Bow River, which has been a gathering place for people from many nations for a very long time. And I owe very much to my Blackfoot friends who support my journey and nourish me in my practice as I figure myself out. It's so much to introduce myself after so much depth of experience and and story that you've all shared. I want to honor that Floyd. I learned so much in your time speaking. It's funny. I've been reading recently about. I'm reading a biography of Tadashi Suzuki, so it was good. It was good prep to hear you speak about his work and some of the questions you got to ask him. And I just want to honor that Floyd, the work that your generation has done and continues to do is the reason that I'm able to be here. It's not just be here in this circle and be in theater, but like be alive. I'm really indebted to storytellers who have the future of Indigenous people in mind. I'm really indebted to you for being able to stand here today, sit here today. I don't know what I am. There's a lot of desire because I function in the Canadian theater industry as an actor and a playwright. I deeply resonated with what you said, Floyd, about Indigenous people kind of being forced to become playwrights. I wasn't going to be a playwright. I was going to be an actor. And suddenly it's like playwriting is like pushed in your face. It's like, well, you must have stories. You must be, you're a young Indigenous person reclaiming your heritage, blah, blah, blah. Everyone wants you to have so much to say now. And so I started writing plays. And I do function as a playwright now. And I'm really grateful for the space that's been given to me to explore that medium of storytelling. But I'm still searching for terms for what I do that are outside of a colonial paradigm. I'm an adoptee. I was adopted when I was 6 months old. I was born here in Mohkinstsis, but my ancestors are Mi'kmaq and settler people. I have been on the journey of figuring out where my people come from for quite some time. I used to believe I was Cree because I knew I wasn't Blackfoot, but I was born in Alberta, but I didn't know anything about my family. And so I've gone through quite a dynamic journey over the last 6 years. My whole life has been a very dynamic journey, but especially the last 6 years of intentionally seeking out answers about my identity. I don't claim a Mi'kmaq community, because to claim a Mi'kmaq community claims to speak for them. It means I claim to speak for and represent them. And a community that doesn't know me, I can't claim to represent. But my ancestors are Mi'kmaq. And right now, the center of my practice as an artist is figuring out how to get as much stuff out of the way as possible, as much of this colonial practice and gig to gig to gig out of the way, so that I can spend the time in provinces away, but I want to be able to spend the time coming home and reconnecting with the community with whom I share bloodlines and ancestors. I know that those ancestors are guiding me and are connected to my feet by my shadow and through Mother Earth. But I speak for displaced people, but every displaced person has a unique story and unique reasons why they're displaced. It's my adoption, but it's also previous colonial displacement policies and choices to hide heritage and all these things that have impacted my journey. So I say that because I think that transparency amongst displaced people is very important. Because when you show up in these spaces, these colonial theater spaces, there's so much desire, especially if you have an articulate voice and a bright smile. There's so much desire to say, here's the stage, here's the, just push him out in front of the camera and press start. And I'm really in many ways grateful for those opportunities, but more than that, I'm grateful to be in a circle like this, where at the end of the day, what I walk away with is incredible teachings from all of you. I started as a performer. I guess I did Fiddler on the Roof, the musical, when I was in high school. but like with my community theater, because I was homeschooled, and like knew I wanted to do theater, musical theater. I didn't really know what that would be like. So I went to a small theater conservatory here in Alberta. Was there for 4 years, and I graduated 2 years ago. So I'm very new to the whole world of all of this, but I started as a kid who wanted to be a musical theater performer, and then an opportunity kind of showed up to write a play. And so I ended up writing a 70-minute solo show that is a folk rock musical set on a Greyhound bus, where I play a somewhat fictionalized version of myself traveling from Calgary to Vancouver in search of my birth mom. And I meet this elderly Native woman along the way who was inspired by the many Cookums who've taken, that's the Cree word for grandmother, and that's the people that have been around me have really, it's shifted throughout my life, but the people who initially took me in and told me to keep looking for answers and to trust my spirit were Cree grandmothers, Cree Cookums. So I wrote the show Cookum and Me to honor particularly one in particular, Helen Northcott, who is a residential school survivor and an elder from Portage-la-Prairie in Manitoba. And there was just these incredible women, these matriarchs, these grandmothers who took me in and said, trust your spirit and keep looking. And I continued to do so. And, I did this play and continue to tweak this play as my journey progresses. I spent a year as the artist in residence at Making Treaty 7 theater company here in Mohkinstsis, where I developed a solo show that explored Napi stories in relation to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which I have, which has continued to impact my life very, very deeply. And I try to be, I'm just like, I'm a bit of a scavenger. I'm picking up teachings and stories wherever I can, and being in ceremony and prayer, to asking for discernment, to know what is from the ancestors, what is from Gizug, the creator, the giver of life, and know what is just distraction, and what is informed by my own desire for colonial fame, and what is informed by the ancestors who are calling me into community, into relationship with those with whom I share that ancestry. So it's even as my mind's racing in a million directions as I listen to all of you speak, and as I speak, trying to say the honest thing, and continue to, I deepen my practice by talking and by listening to myself talk and getting off the Zoom call and going, that made no sense, and just taking what teachings I can. I think that as a displaced person, as an adoptee, as a person who spent significantly more time in white society and culture, albeit a very particular, it was very, very evangelical, very strict home that I lived in. Not a good place. So I'm very informed by that, and I'm informed by the things that I had to do to survive that. And so I am very invested and interested in this discussion about dramaturgy, bridging settler and Indigenous perspectives. And I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, but is it Albert Marshall who kind of introduced us initially to an academic understanding of the concept of Eduabdimunk, or two-eyed seeing?
Eduabdimunk, yes, two-eyed seeing.
As I understand it, this is a Mi'kmaq worldview which seeks to draw from the strengths of a Mi'kmaq worldview as well as the strengths of a settler worldview to acknowledge the world that we live in. I think the word decolonization is a very the reconciliation that kind of, we use that word a lot, and then people went, wait a minute, there's nothing to reconcile because there was no relationship established in the first place. And so we started in contemporary circles using the term decolonization. And I like that term, but the struggle with it is that we also can't go back to a pre-colonial state. And so I think that Two-Eyed Scene is a very, very future-minded worldview that says this is what we have, this is where we are, this is where we're coming from, but also this is where we're going, and this is how we can get there together, led by a Mi'kmaq worldview. You know, Eruaptamung is a Mi'kmaq word, not an English word. So we as Mi'kmaq people or people with Mi'kmaq ancestry, I'm still figuring out the terms around that for myself. But as a person who's seeking to understand myself through my Mi'kmaq ancestors and through the present day, very much alive Mi'kmaq communities, I understand this word to be exactly what we're talking about here today as we talk about this bridging of settler and Indigenous dramaturgy. I'm really interested in I'm in a dramaturgy lab right now at the Citadel Theatre because I'm the artistic associate at Theatre Calgary. So I'm really I'm in these big institutions, and so I've been doing dramaturgy, and I've been working with playwrights, settler playwrights and Indigenous playwrights, on the development of their work. And so I'm doing some dramaturgy training right now. And one of the things that I spoke about in our first meeting last week with that program was that I'm really interested in both coming from the POV of a disabled person with FASD, as well as a displaced Indigenous person who is already bridging worlds constantly. I'm very interested in dramaturgs that aren't dramaturgs. The people that have informed my process the most have been Claytley Dene Elder Marcel Gagnon, who is a Juno-nominated singer-songwriter and FASD advocate, and he himself has FASD, and him and I have worked together on a show that he created. I was in the room when he did his first ever theater piece, but he's ended up being he doesn't come from a theater perspective, but he offers far more dramaturgically to me than any theater trained person ever has. And when I created Snowblind, my solo show about Napi and my FASD, and I want to honor that Snowblind, the show, was named Snowblind because in the original Napi story that I based it on, Napi claims to be snowblinded so that he can get the sympathy of this woman, but he's actually really blinded because of a spell that he did too many times, which is something I really resonated with, having FASD. But something that I learned much later than, like, about almost a year after I did Snowblind, the show, I learned that I was born under the snow blinding moon in Mi'kmaq, a Bugnajet or a Bignajet. I've heard both. And so there's something about the way that the moon I was born under, and I was so glad to hear you, Floyd, speak about introducing ourselves with the moon that we were born beneath, because I was born beneath a Bugnajet, and I wind up telling this story about the people here, and directed and created with and informed by the Blackfoot people here. And I worked with an elder, Joyce Healy from Gaina, who was my primary dramaturg on that piece. And so I've worked with elders as dramaturgs, and I'm beginning to be interested in other people. I have a friend who is in theater, but is also a doula, who comes to dramaturgy from the perspective of being a doula, and calls herself a new play doula. And it's fine and dandy for a dramaturg to call themselves a new play doula, but it's a different thing when you're actually a doula, and that is your vocation and the way you understand the world and the body. So I'm very curious about dramaturgs that aren't traditional dramaturgs, because I quite frankly don't have time for too many more theater people in my life, because I'm trained in the white Canadian theater system, and as I continue my journey home, I need to find voices outside of that to guide me. And so I'm grateful for this circle of people that think in very different ways. And I'm just excited to learn, continue to learn. I've learned so much in the last, whatever it is, 45 minutes. And yeah, I'll leave you with that. Walaliag mzunogama. Thank you, everyone.
Walaliag, Zach, Habiganajit. I would like to hear Jill next. She'll give us a perspective. And the two-eyed seeing, edu optimum, it's a two perspectives, seeing one eye from a mainstream context and the other eye from the indigenous context. It's a methodological approach in a integrative science program that we had running at Cape Breton University. And,
Miigwech, Chief Stephen, and thank you all for thank you, Daniel, for inviting me here today. Chief Stephen, Miigwech, for your beautiful opening and the way you put us in the right place. And to Floyd and Zach and Paula and Daniel, thank you for just your rich thoughts and ideas and all the knowledge that you're sharing here. Jill Carter Nadishnakas, Anishnabeakwa Ashkenazi Kwayandao. I'm going to try to say this properly, pronouncing it in Ghana Gahea. I'm Anishinaabe, so that's why I'm going to try. Zidagarondo no Dunjaba. I used to say Dagaronto, but I think it's Zidagarondo. And please, if you're a Ghana Gahea speaker out there, please forgive me because I'm probably still butchering it, but I think I'm getting better. So I come from where the trees grow out of the water, a city, so-called Toronto, the city itself, on the banks of Ontario, the beautiful lake. And I send a hearty thank you to the many, many peoples and nations who have stewarded this wonderful territory for millennia. The Erie, the Peyton, the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Cayuga and the Seneca and the Ghana Gahea peoples, as well as most recently the Mississauga Anishinaabe. I would also like to send out my thanks to the Muwekma Ohlone peoples of California. I'm speaking to you now through a device of metal and glass, a computer, and I'm speaking to you, and we are speaking to each other across a platform, a Zoom platform. And Zoom, like Skype, like many other of these platforms, have erected their key operational arms in Palo Alto, California, the traditional lands of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. We are deeply indebted to them because the lands and the waters that they continue to steward now support the people, the pipelines, and the technologies that carry our breaths, images, and words across vast distances to each other. I'd also like to say that as I acknowledge in communications such as this one, and every time I open my so-called notebook, my computer notebook, I personally must acknowledge the debt that I have incurred and that is amassing. We are all indebted to these peoples and communities whose water and lands have been poisoned as a result of the extraction of metals and rare earth elements required to fabricate the machinery through which we are speaking to each other, through which we are viewing each other. We are indebted to those peoples whose working lives, whose youth, whose vitality have been spent in unsafe spaces and intolerable conditions, so that many citizens of the so-called developed world might have easy access to these and related devices. I feel powerless in the face of this, but I take up, until I know better and can do better, I take up the little power that I have, which is to say that whatever I do with these devices and on these platforms, I will do my very best to be creative, to be honest, to maybe do some good. So, miigwech. Dramaturgy, bridging. Okay. I've been thinking about dramaturgy for a long time. And it was so wonderful to listen to Floyd today, whom I've listened to over the years in many contexts. But I say today, I identify today because, or listening today, and I identify Floyd right now because I've been looking back at a couple things, and I was really stirred by what you said, Floyd, about theoreticians, and it wasn't good, you know, we weren't really welcome as theoreticians. And I mean, it's just this incredible spider's web. It's an incredible web. Why? When I began, and you know, I began rather late in life myself. I come to academia late, like Daniel, like Paula, like others here. I came late in life, at least to the graduate program. I started my undergraduate, I suppose, at ages with everybody else, but when I came to graduate studies, I started my master's in 2001. And when I began my master's, the theoretical writing that I was expected to engage with and out there said that we had no processes as Indigenous people, that basically we borrowed Western, you know, this Western invention we call theater, and we put our own stories into it. And in fact, I read little interviews by some of our artists who tended to fall into that, because that is a story that we were told over and over, and that is a story that many came to believe. And here, when I began my PhD, all of a sudden I am to theorize on Spider Woman theater. And I began this work because Spider Woman and Monique Mujica asked me to do this work, to document their process, to document that journey, and to make sure that it was out there for younger generations of Indigenous artists coming up, and that it was credited to them, and that their teachers and their parents and their elders who gave them what they gave them to create their work in story weaving. And Floyd, he was the first Native theoretician I ever read. The Artificial Tree, The Language of Orphans. So, I mean, there were, in theater, there were, of course, many other literary theoreticians, many, thank goodness, many Indigenous literary theoreticians, pedagogical theoreticians, much else out there which I could draw from. But Floyd was there. So thank you, Floyd. Chimagwach. Because much of my own work, you know, starts with the seeds that Floyd planted, both personally and in person and in the very writing. So I say chimagwach to Floyd for this. Boy, well, that was a long haul. I'm just going to have to trust you, Daniel, to cut me off and shut me up. Bridging. I'll just jump to bridging. Well, what might this look like? And what is dramaturgy, by the way? I took a dramaturgical course as a master's student, and at the end of the course, a whole year we spent all we smarty pants master students. And at the end of the year, we said, what is dramaturgy? We don't know. But it was fun. It was fun and valuable. So for me, I guess the work that I do as a so-called dramaturge, and I do this thing that some people call dramaturgy sometimes, as well as being a performer and a director and an educator, I do this thing. So what do? Well, I think a lot about structures. I think a lot about process. How do we create this stuff? I think a lot about structure. And Floyd, thank you again. You were talking a lot about structure. But I think a lot about structure because drawing from Zach, you thank you. You thanked many of the people here today, and not just for their beautiful work, but for your own life. And the stories contain our lives. The stories have power, all stories that are told. Those words have power and they resonate, and they may be the difference between life and death. They're certainly the reason that people treat one group the way they do, based on stories they've come to believe. They're the reasons people treat themselves the way they treat themselves because of the stories they've come to believe, etc. We know this. We know how important the story is. But I'm interested in the way the story is structured. Thomas King has certainly written about this in his Truth About Stories. And I certainly think about, although I know I have not drunk alcohol in too many years to count. I no longer drink alcohol, and not that I would have known this when I did drink alcohol, but I think of chefs or, I don't know, connoisseurs telling you that wine tastes different according to the glass it's in. I think of chefs talking about plating their food, and that the food tastes different the way it's arranged. And the story, so the structure, the container affects the content. And then the content affects life. So I'm very interested in structures. And of course, I've been very interested in working with, and very blessed to work with people now who are working and taking their structures straight from the land itself. When we think of those spirals we see in the tree rings. Well, what is a stump, a set of tree rings? Is it not a story engraved in the land? And a spiraling story. And then we look at those plains, those plains winter counts told in spirals. We listen to spiraling storytellers. I could be that one. I'm in danger of spiraling off. So Daniel will have to cut me off fast. This is we take so much of our life way, our way of doing life, the way we structure everything that we do, from the way the planets move, from the way the seasons move, from the way the land moves us. And so I work with people like I've worked with Floyd. I've been blessed to work with Floyd. I've been blessed to work with Monique Mujica and the Chocolate Woman Collective, blessed to really get in there and look at, allow the land to direct the structure of the story, the structure of the stories. And that brings me then to bridging. And some of the things that were said about being groomed as playwrights, and even having, I think, that structure groomed. I mean, I would like to tell a quick story if there's time. It's a story of a young man I met. I was still a graduate student and I was teaching. I won't say I teach across several programs at the University of Toronto, and just to protect identities, I'm not going to say where I met this young man. I can say this man was Ganagahel, Mohawk person, very young and lovely and creative human being. And this lovely creative human being got into an indigenous program that helped, that nurtured young people who would like to write theater. He had a story to tell. And so he got into this program. And he was given, and many people in this program won't get an Indigenous dramaturge. I mean, they'll get a lovely dramaturge, but a non-Indigenous. But he was given an Indigenous dramaturge. But a dramaturge, perhaps, who had been themselves groomed, coming from an earlier generation, by all non-Indigenous educators and artists and theoreticians. And so this, I encountered this, I encountered this young man a few months later, and I said to this young person, I said, how is the story? It's such an amazing story. How is the writing going? He said, I stopped writing. I can't write this story. And I said, why? It's a beautiful story. Why? And he said, I can't. He said, he showed me a piece of paper that he'd received from his dramaturge. He couldn't fit the story into the piece of paper. And the piece of paper was the structure for the well-made play. So many characters, so many acts, a climax here, conflict there. This was not the story he wanted to tell. In fact, his own story, really, as he would have told it, unfolded as a spiral and folded back on itself and then folded out again. And I thought, here was a young voice who is also, in many ways, this is no positive or negative judgments, but a young man finding himself. He makes me think a little of you, Zach, but you've had time maybe to do some finding where he was still at an earlier stage, right? Much earlier stage than you, perhaps, but wanting and desiring and seeking and looking. And here was a story, I think, to help him put things together. And he was stopped. And so I think about bridging, and I'm wondering right now, I think about Dylan Robinson and David Garneau, who speak about irreconcilable spaces of Aboriginality. And I think that I also think about the Afro-American trauma therapist, Resmaa Menakem, who does his work. And I bring him up because his work is very embodied, and we are people working in an embodied, theater is embodied. And we're seeing across Canada and across North America, we're seeing, what has happened in terms of skin color and race. And it's endemic. It's in the professional world. It's in the training grounds. It's in the undergraduate programs. It's in the graduate programs. We are seeing the harm that has been done to the Indigenous body and the brown body and the Black body, all of the bodies out there, peoples of culture. And Resmaa Menakem talks about white body supremacy, not white supremacy. White supremacy is something easy to perhaps deny and easy to believe that does not exist for a nice person personally. Many people are not white supremacists, but there may be some embodied memory of white body supremacy. An embodied, remembered by within the DNA structure, when the white ancestor was human and the non-white was not human. I mean, is this not what Canada is founded on? America, too. The doctrines of terra nullius, the doctrines of extinguishment, the doctrine of discovery. And how do those doctrines work? Those papal bulls that came down and said to Christians who were wrestling with this, well, how can we go in and kill like those Muslims over there and take their land and enslave them? How can we take human beings and enslave them, buy and sell them? How can we take these people and kill them or destroy them or imprison them or whatever, suppress them and take their lands? Like, this isn't Christian behavior. How can we do this? They said, well, the Pope said, well, you can, because they aren't Christian. If you're not fully human, if you don't adhere to the structure and the code that human beings adhere to, then you're somehow less than human. And this is happening again today. We are seeing books like Francis Widdowson and Alfred Howard. They are political scientists. They were shortlisted in 2009. Their book, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, was shortlisted for a top social science prize. Well, who votes on these? Who nominates these? Teachers at universities, professors, politicians, perhaps, educators. And what does this book say? This book says that we Indigenous people are less than human. It's a matter of evolution. And we haven't evolved. And so they got to drag us unevolved, Neolithics, into the 21st century where our little brains are exploding now, so to speak. I'm paraphrasing very crudely, but this is the crux. So again, this idea of not human, not quite. This is part of that master narrative and that structure. So to bridge, I'm not sure. I think it can happen, but I'd like to start on separate sides of the bridge a little bit. I'd like a room of one's own, to quote Virginia Woolf. Places to grow. We've been taken off the land. How do we find that dramaturgy? Reg Croshew, during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talks, there's a beautiful quote in the final report where he says, Indigenous people, we have to reconcile with the land. When you've been pulled away, when you've been pulled into kinds of work, when you are stuck in a structure and infrastructure where perhaps you weren't dealing and living the way your ancestors dealt and lived. You need to go back and rediscover that relationship. You need to go back and reconcile yourself with your territories, your relatives, your land. So that's work we need to do as artists. I need to do that. I need to understand what it is. And I need to listen. Listening came up here. I thought I was a good listener because I took acting, I learned acting. I did a lot of listening exercises. I thought I was a great listener. And I'm not bad. But I never learned to listen properly to the land. My mother could. But of course, my mother was just so uncool. I didn't want to be my mother. So I didn't learn to listen the way my mother listened. And so now I've gone into places and now I realize, hey, wait a minute. Maybe I'm not supposed to walk on top of this risen area called Hawk Hill or Bear Mound in High Park. Because have I asked for consent? Have I heard consent? Sorry, I'm going on. So this is part of the dramaturgy I'm trying to think of and work with my friends and fellow artists. Separate rooms separate healings of the body, separate discoveries, and then perhaps we come together and we trade that knowledge, because I love that two-eyed seeing, two-eyed seeing. I do believe, as our ancestors believed, that, everybody has, you come to the potluck, you don't all bring, as much as I love pound cake and chocolate cake, you don't all bring pound cake and chocolate cake. Or, most people, 100 people bring pound cake. It's not going to be a very fun potluck, right? Except perhaps for Jill, who loves sweets. But other people are going to go, I'm sick. Where's the Three Sisters soup? Where's this? Where's that? So we bring everything to the potluck. But I need some time in the kitchen alone to begin to really cook properly with these ingredients, so to speak, to experiment and to not be afraid of, quote, failure, to not be groomed. Because what are we being groomed for? If we're being groomed as artists to put bums in seats and please a non-Indigenous audience, which is largely the audiences, for most of the theaters now, the subscribers, to please the subscribers, maybe we need to think another way about dramaturgy. I mean, as I remember, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten, but those Germans who invented dramaturgy, and I forget, Paula will know, the first, what's his name? I can't hear you.
Lessing.
Thank you, Lessing. What did he say? The dramaturge educated the audience. So as Indigenous dramaturgs, maybe, the theoretician, we got to get out there and educate, change them to understand. Sorry, I can shut up now because I've gone way over my time. I did not mean to be disrespectful to you all. And I do apologize profusely. Thank you. I think you knew what I meant, though. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. You've very well explained and informed us very well from your perspective and your experience. It was really awesome. I think we have till 7 o'clock Eastern time. Danielle?
Actually, we were going to go till 6:30, so we are close to. So perhaps I don't know. Maybe if we can just maybe quickly skip the stone across the water.
Sure. Okay. So what we'll do is I'll go back to Floyd and then go through the order again. Paula and Zach, and then Jill again. I think one of the things too that has to be brought into the dialogue of bridging is bridging with children, young people. They need to be brought into back to the land, on the land, and teachings have to go to them. And theater, somebody wrote, I don't know, somebody's article I read. I mean, children, they're a great audience out there. So anyway, Floyd, the orphan language.
Okay. Yes. Chief. So I'll present. I'll quickly make a few comments. So regarding the way the stories are structured, bridging settler and Indigenous dramaturgy, and the children, as you just mentioned, just to stay focused is so we created a festival here on my reserve. We kind of work with the formula of tradition times process equals theater squared, theater doubled, and it's framed by brackets F sometimes H, family, because one of the things that defines Indigenous performance within a community is its connection to family, because we're all related on this in these communities. So, and then that gives you the idea of like, what is the purpose of the theater then? So that always raises that question. And of course, it's always what defines Indigenous people. There's a lot of struggles people have with identity, like if they're, and so as Indigenous artists, for us here, what we just define ourselves as Indigenous people is like we live in a community, and our goal is future generations, in the same way that our traditions always work towards that end. Like the Mohawk people, they always say, for the children yet unborn who come, you know, that's where they are, they are working for, with their regards to their traditions. One of the interesting things I read when I was a student, well, learning, I kind of learned as I went. Since I finished school, I learned in the last 20 years, 30 years, I kind of learned as I went about theories. I read Eisenstein, Sergei Eisenstein. He was originally from Latvia. He wrote an essay called Cinema and the Japanese Ideogram. But he's talking about those letters, kanji letters. And he was saying his proposition was it's interesting, he said, to use the idea of how it's already structured. They have different narrative structures within their language. How would this look if it was applied to cinema? Rather than following, and that made me think of like, rather than following the conventional models of performance, how would it look if we used our existing models of how we compose images, how we compose narratives? How would what would be the result in a performance? That was my proposition, my premise. And so along that lines, I looked at Plains Indian winter count systems, where they look at a year, and then they select one image, one central image that talks about that year. It's a metonymic image. And then from there, they go into other stories. So it's almost it's a narrative tool also for the storyteller, but also a compositional narrative. It's a compositional structure, because in there also is encoded composition of even the body. So of how that winter count image can be a compositional tool for not only narrative structures, but body structures, group structures, how you can compose bodies on stage. So I was looking at that. And then the other thing, like I said, Plains Indian Sign Language, how that can be a narrative structure. And, because within the Plains Indian Sign Language is encoded how that language composes narratives and images, and how they put them together through the use of symbols. So within that, I thought that's an interesting model into approaching narrative and action. And lastly, just quickly, because I don't want to take too long, that's also is like one of my not only talking with people, reading. I read this anthropologist, his journals. He was a German painter. He painted the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe people around the Great Lakes area. He recorded their stories. He's actually very good. Like he's one of the best narrative recorders. He records a story of an Anishinaabe warrior surrounded by Dakota warriors. They're going to kill him, but he says, "Wait, let me tell you a story." He's wounded already, and he starts telling them stories of all the Dakotas that he killed in battle. His story goes on so long, pretty soon the Dakotas, the warriors who surrounded him, are laying on the grass. Some are smoking, listening to him, enjoying his stories. And then he ends his story by saying, "And I conclude my narrative by taking a few of you with me to the other side." And he starts stabbing them. So I was thinking, that's a good acting story, because it's about intention, objective. It's through that story, he has an objective. So that's a good acting story for classes. And it's the same with the Dakota story by Charles Eastman, where a family is making, stirring stuff in a pot. An enemy is looking at them from on top. The husband says, wife, there's somebody looking at us. Let's pretend to be talking. So they have a conversation. And then he takes his bows that he's been working on, and pretty soon he shoots. So there now, that's an act, that's about objectives, intentions. So that's a story that's already, sometimes I think Stanislavski, he didn't, well, of course, he didn't invent the idea of objective and super objectives. Those are universal principles already that are encoded in stories, of all cultures. So those are stories that bridges teaching, those two stories of narrative, of acting exercise. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Welaliek. I will call Paula next.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. Great, Floyd. I'll say, Floyd, you were the first theoretician that I ever met theoretician that I ever met. And it was at least 20 years ago, I guess, maybe but that was pretty exciting, meeting a real theoretician, because it was unusual at the time. And I remember all of that. I guess I think I want to say two things. One is I'll speak to structure very quickly, and then leave with one question that does guide me. And it's very interesting thinking about these structures. And when I think about my own education, I've had such great teachers. I've been so very lucky. I've worked with Muriel Miguel. I met her many years ago, and what a wonderful education that gave me. And well, there's so many people. I just want to say thank you to all the teachers that I have had. And in terms of this structure and this idea of what I consider about sort of shifting paradigms, trying to move out of these old models that don't necessarily offer that bridge, but kind of keep us constricted in ways of working and in stories. And I'm interested in historiographies as well, breaking down those historiographies that have robbed history, robbed our essence of even being. And I think dramaturgy can do that. It can rework historiography so that we can move into the future with something more real and true. And but these structures, I'm just going to say, for example, very quickly, there was one situation, and I will refer back to this opera that I worked on before, which was this combination of sort of bridging these collaborators from all these various backgrounds. And when I came into this situation with so many Indigenous artists and a number of the white settlers who we were all working as collaborators, as a dramaturg, I had this idea in opera. Here's where I began thinking. I thought, okay, form, content. And I'm thinking form equals music, equals opera, equals Eurocentric, equals old. That was my kind of structural formula, thinking about opera. Then in terms of content to me was then the libretto, which was written by Marie Clements. Libretto equals story. That story was Indigenous, and that was new for opera. So I had these, and it didn't take very long for me to sort of look at this idea, these structural ways of thinking about how to come into opera and these relationships, before I realized that's all wrong. And oh boy, Marion Newman, if any of you know Marion, she was singing one of the major roles. When to speak to her about the ancientness of opera to her and her people was just one little example of how I had to actually learn that, in fact, this Indigenous story, this was the old story. This was where we had to operate out of. The new was the opera, was the Eurocentric. I mean, this is, my settler mind. this is how I was operating. So, and I just use that as an example. It may be obvious to all of you, but it took me, I had to do that turnaround. And that is after many years. I just, the journey is so long, and there's so much work to be done. And I keep thinking that we're making inroads, that we're getting somewhere. And I think we are, but it's also very slow. And I must be better, faster, better educated at my own learning. Part of this leaves me in the question that I'm really troubled by and guided by. And that is in my work as a dramaturge, it's in my work as a researcher in academia. And that is this work of bridging. When is it best done together? And when is it best done apart? And that's partly, I think, Jill, to your point of a room of one's own. And that has been a huge part of my education as well, is I began thinking coming together is the way we have to do this work. And what I have really, really learned is stepping apart sometimes and doing it separately. And but Jill knows this, we've talked about this a great deal. Sometimes it breaks my heart. I don't like that because I want it to be, but I'm learning to really respect that may be the way of bringing about change and a more balanced relationship. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Paula. I will ask Zach next.
Walaliag, everyone, for the more that continues to arrive into my ears and mind and spirit. Jill, it's so incredible to hear you speak. Yeah, I'm gonna not continue to muddle around there, but Walaliag. Something I want to speak to is, and I speak to this any chance I get in any space that I'm invited into, because I think it's, people are starting to speak to it, but still somewhat of a new concept. It's not a new concept, but it's a hard one to make stick. And that is that if someone does my play in Calgary, that's not Indigenous theater, because I'm not from here. I'm not from this land. I'm a guest, the same as anyone who's not Blackfoot or Stony and who've been here since time immemorial, or the Stony people. There are people that have come up and down. Like there's a Dene people that have moved through this area, and their stories are different than the Blackfoot stories, but there are people whose stories connect them to this place. And my story connects me to this place because I was born here. My mother was born here. But I don't have a community connected to this place. And in my role as artistic associate at Theatre Calgary, I recently curated a festival of queer theater, and one of the playwrights was a Blackfoot matriarch. And her work is the first time that Blackfoot work has been done at Theatre Calgary. Not the first time a Blackfoot person has been on stage, but the first time a Blackfoot playwright has been invited into the space being Zoom. But nevertheless, the most storied company in Mohkinstsis in its many, many year history has only worked on a Blackfoot show once, and it was on Zoom. And we see this all across Turtle Island, the pan-indigenizing, the making of a monolith of Indigenous peoples. As long as it's Indigenous, the more important thing becomes, will our audience buy it, and trying to explain to artistic leaders that we have to tell the stories of the people who are from this land, Chief Stephen, can you, what the word in Mi'kmaq, Wedgie Scaliatieg?
Yes.
This means we sprouted from here is how I understand Wedgie Scaliatieg. And so I can't say that here. Some of you are on that land, not that specific territory, but Mi'kma'ki, I'm from my ancestors come from one of the other of the 7 districts, but so I can't say that here. And I want us to be telling the stories of the people who can say that, who can step onto the stage and say whatever, utter whatever in their language, however they say, I sprouted from here. Those are the people whose stories we need to be telling. So that is why I have fought for this role at Theatre Calgary, is because in this community, the thing I'm most interested in is amplifying the Blackfoot voice, so that the Blackfoot people can stand on our stages in front of a lot of people, hopefully more Blackfoot people than white people someday, and say, we're from here, we're here, we sprouted from here, from this land, and we continue to live on this land and tell our story for future generations. So I think we have to get away from just doing whatever Indigenous thing strikes our fancy. I'm convinced it's a deliberate colonial tactic to keep people, to bring other Indigenous people who aren't from that land into the spaces, because I think it continues, there's nothing to acknowledge. If the story being told at Theatre Calgary is a Salish story or a Mi'kmaq story, there's nothing to acknowledge other than here is the story that there's no responsibility when you leave the theater, because the people here, the settler people, don't have a responsibility to the Salish or the Mi'kmaq people. The people of Calgary do not have the same responsibility to me that they have to my friend Troy, who is a Blackfoot theater practitioner. So how can we start to create that bridge, so to speak, so that the land can heal, and so that the people can heal, and so that we all can heal. Like, for me, as a person of Mi'kmaq heritage, I want to be able to exist here as a guest, and it's different. The Indigenous person who is living on land that is not their own is different than a settler, because we have ancient protocols for how our people across Turtle Island have had trade routes and relations with each other that are outside of a colonial paradigm of how we exist on this land. But it's still like that is a space that there's settlers and there's Indigenous people. And I'm like, well, what about the Indigenous people who are, in a way, settlers on the land that they're on? How do we start to acknowledge that and I don't know what the word is, but reintroduce the stories to the land and to the people. Yeah, because theater, we have all these resources to tell stories, and I don't think that big theater companies are ever going to be the most important way that we share our stories. I'm not seeing piles and piles of Indigenous youth in the audience, but when I did Snowblind, I had somewhere between 60 and 90 Indigenous youth see the show, and the feedback afterwards was incredible. The impact that it had, and all I can do is continue to hope that my work has that impact. But I don't want to do 25 shows for 1,800 people and 90 of them are Indigenous. So I don't think that the big theater model is the ultimate way for us to bring about this kind of healing that I'm talking about. But the big theater still has a responsibility to contribute to it rather than contribute to erasure, which is what's currently happening by and large across the country. So I offer that. I'm still sussing out what that means for me and my roles, but that's a huge part of my perspective, and I think it's really important. So,
thank you. I would like to just make a comment saying that my my grandfather used to say once, us indigenous people, we never go camping. We just lay our skin down and go to sleep. It's, we are home everywhere. So next, Jill. Thank you, Jill.
Miigwech, Chief
Stephen.
Stephen, sorry. Too many windows open on my screen. I'm so sorry. Chief
it's okay.
Stephen, thank you. I'm thinking of something that the Stolo writer Lee Miracle said. Earlier this year, I was privileged to take part in an event that she arranged, that she organized at the University of Toronto. It was called Undoing the Privilege of Writing. And she said this: Indigenous people have story without place, while Europeans have place without story. Of course, I mean, it. We'll take this. We some of us have some place or are allowed into our places, but I've been thinking a lot about this. What she said here, and in terms of what's being said by Zach, by Floyd, by Paula, by all of you, and this sense of talking about framework, talking about, I think, to some degree, some sort of colonial hunger, a hunger for, yes, come in and tell your story. And why is that? It'd be, is it just because the government's allocated so many funds, and so you want to use up you want to get that grant money, so you've got to, quote, diversity or let in some indigenize? Or is it real interest? Or is there an element of what David Garneau terms as scopophilia, this sort of hunger to see, to take, a voyeuristic hunger, to take what is seen as exotic, or to take what is stimulating because it's indigenous pain, on display, perhaps. Show me your stories about this happening to you or your people, or this happening to you or your ancestors, or this happening. And sometimes I want to say, why don't you show me your stories about your grandfather, the perpetrator? Sorry. What it's like to be perhaps a descendant of a perpetrator, and what resonates in your DNA for that. But we don't see those stories, do we? Anyway, I'm not meaning to be mean, although that sounded a bit mean, but I do mean to throw those questions out, because I think some truth telling is needed. I think also I bring up Lee's quote there because that's what I'm talking about also when I'm talking about these spaces, that we need to be, let back into our space, our place, to do the work on that place, so that we can find the stories, and to be allowed to do it in our own time. I'm a member of First Story Toronto. It's a group where we give Indigenous tours of the city of Dagaranto. Yeah, I said it wrong. I'm sorry. Si Dagarondo. That sounds better. Sorry. When I met Rodney Babawash, who began the Toronto Native History Project, and started and went on. I wasn't working with them at the time. I just went on the tours. I was just a fan. We do 5-hour bus tours, sitting on an old school bus. And oh boy, did it hurt your butt! But it was amazing. It was just amazing to hear these stories, to hear these elders, to also hear theater people, Indigenous theater people like Alanis King and others coming and being the storytellers too with the elders, and this back and forth and learning so much. And then later, after Rodney passed in 2002, his widow, Heather, slowly pulled me into First Story herself. And so I became part of this. And we do what, you know, so now I'm a researcher and tour guide, and it's so much fun. And all that is just telling a bunch of stories, getting out on the land and telling the story. Except now what has seemed to happen over time. And now I think something that we are fighting very hard as First Story is sort of audience demand. Now they want us to give them the tour in an hour. They want us to fit. They want to fit, you know, and again, that's a dramaturgical thing. How long is this play? Is this a 3-hour play? Is this a 2-hour play? Is this a 1.5 hour? Where's the intermission? Or is this a 280-hour play that has to take place, you know, 3 times a week over 6 months and timed out so that when we get to the story of Elder Brother in the play, the snow is on the ground, right? And when we get to this story, it's just, I mean, you know, why is the rule Tuesday through Saturday, 8 to whatever? And the same with this, they are trying to direct to squeeze this. So we say, well, we're not going to give you a tour. I refuse. I say, no, I'm not doing it. Can't do it in an hour. Won't, you're not really getting anything. I mean, because part of our tour is not about edifying an audience so you can get this information and wow, wasn't that great? Now you can say, oh, I went on this tour and I know this about, did you know this building over here or this park over here? Part of this is about get a story, which is the call, and respond. So now we're trying to build in activations. We're trying to build in, so leave a story behind. Give us something. You want a bridge? You want to come? Well, then play in our, I don't know, I was going to say play on our football field, which is such a horrible metaphor, but excuse me, I'm exhausted, right? But, play by our rules for a little bit. Enter our world. Play with us in our time frame, with our season, in our time frame, in our narrative structure, and give back when you're asked to give back. And offer back when you're asked. Sorry, that was again, I promised I wouldn't be long, and I was very long. I apologize again. I'm doing better, though.
All right. Thank you, Jill. Speaking about long in our ways, I was in a folklore class many, many years ago. I can't even remember now. But one of the projects was to go and interview my grandfather and ask him, when were there any big trouts in our river, along the Rishabakta River where I was growing up? And he started to poured himself a cup of tea and said, well, when I married your grandmother, he starts, and he never finished the story. And he says, come back tomorrow. Next day I came back with a notebook and everything. He said, well, when we were married 20 years, there used to be fish in there. There used to be trout there. And but he still didn't answer the question. Were there big trout there, sea trout? Anyway, I had to wait about 3-4 days before he gave me the answer. But that's in our time. Anyway, Danielle, I guess you're going to round it off and finish everything, I guess.
Well, I just want to say it's been been interesting listening, and it's a real journey of seeing great possibilities and impossibilities. But I think a word that came up a couple of times, I think Floyd brought it up first, and then Zach mentioned it, and I think it's come up a lot, is the word healing. And I've always believed that that this transformation that theater offered was a healing for the both for the practitioner and for the viewer. And I feel like that's a word that I really want to take away from this and meditate on and consider. And I'm so grateful that you've all agreed that you're all here, and that this has been the most wonderful dinner party, though there's been no dinner, but there's been so much nourishment.
Okay, I will close off, and stories, that's all we are. As we heard earlier, stories, that's all we are. I arrived in Alberta one time, and I was involved in a sweat lodge ceremony in the Treaty 6 area, Frog Lake. And I was there with Joe Canicpiatos. Ovid McCurdy introduced me as a Mi'kmaq from the East Coast. He brings with him a story of creation among his people. And the elder, Joe, was about 92 years old, and he was a sweat lodge keeper and a Sundance chief. And he said he had a dream. And he said that he saw somebody coming towards him, and the sun was arising behind him. And as the person arrived, he said the person gave him a gift. And he said, I turned around and I gave him my pipe. And so he said, that was the story, and I have to give you my pipe. So he gave me his pipe that belonged to a wandering spirit that was hanged during the Louis Riel Rebellion. And so he gave me his pipe, and he told me to look after it, but bring it back before you go anywhere. So I've sent the pipe back, but that was the gift from him. And that pipe led me to a lot of places and a lot of ceremonies in France, in Germany, in Europe, in Italy, in Spain, and back all across the country. And then I gave it to another Alberta elder to take back to the family. And he took it back, and it's back in Alberta. So it was a pipe I carried for about 15 years. Anyway, so that's my story. And I would just like to close off with a little words. I don't like to use the English word prayer. I talk to the spirits. Gisu okulali guchi nigela kisi maupuguadi nigela edlewi studia abo on madulti mulgigna wadi ignamuye niskamisnagu sedewin bawiche kio and kijinan ma amigel keluskap nukumia not oltio mijuaji studa and kijina welali chitin setkoi. I thanked all the 7 sacred directions and thanked them for guiding us in our deliberation, in our words, and protecting us. And I said to look after everybody on their way home this evening. And I also wished good luck and good spirits for your family. Thank you, Walalio.